When the ancients first began looking at what it means to lead a good life to obtain happiness, they began by using philosophy to unpack the world around them.
They believed that the secret to happiness was to master our thoughts through philosophy in order to conquer the reality of our world.
By contemplating life's biggest questions, philosophers like Socrates and Aristotle discovered
that humans could control how they lead their lives by using reason to combat difficult times. Contemporary scientific perspectives have wrestled with
how the brain creates the feeling of what we call happiness.
But a widely accepted theory is that of a hedonic treadmill created by scientists Brickman and Campbell in a 1971 study.
In this theory, human beings do not habituate, but rather recalibrate to their heritable level of happiness.
An individual's happiness, as subjective as it may appear,
is arranged within a probable distribution in which they will achieve a level of satisfaction in their lifetime.
Ancients believed that voluntary actions contribute to our overall happiness. But how does this meet contemporary ideas of genetics predetermining our happiness? In our modern world, how can we step outside our happiness capacity? When I started speaking to people about happiness, they said things like,
I think I'm really biased by working with happiness research.
Some spark of positive prospects.
I have a stable home, I have food coming in, and I'm working towards a positive goal in my community, and it makes me feel good.
I'm part of this thing. I'm part of these people who believe that it's possible, and we try it every day.
We're involved in something that's bigger than ourselves, and it's productive, pro-social, and I wake up every day, and I'm excited to see what changes will come.
So I think, happiness is the difference between where you are and where you want to be. And you can change both of these. You can change where you are and you can change where you want to be.
And the key thing to note is the differences between types of happiness. Harvard psychologist Daniel Gilbert divides happiness into emotional happiness, moral happiness, and judgmental happiness, all of which contribute to happiness in terms of the ancient Greek word eudaimonia. Let me explain. The word eudaimonia refers to a type of happiness that originates from flourishing in your life. This happiness isn't fleeting or caused by single actions or events, but consists of long-term satisfaction. There isn't a direct translation into English, but eudaimonia is beyond daily contentment and is evident when you reach your full potential to function in your greatest capacity. Eudaimonia is a totality in happiness and roughly translates to something past just happiness, but rather a flourishing through meaning. The term was first popularized by this guy, Aristotle, an ancient Greek philosopher. The constant philosophizing of happiness in the ancient world continues into contemporary times as we philosophize unknowingly. It's difficult to pinpoint how certain philosophies have translated into our current day from antiquity. When aspects of Stoicism or Epicureanism reflect in people's actions, it isn't because they're poring over the teachings of Seneca. It's because in certain areas of the globe, certain people have developed a way to think about our world and have passed it down to their progeny. If a child chooses to educate themselves differently than how their parents taught them, they may still hold on to these generational philosophies and continue to practice them without knowing their roots. But they're still practicing philosophy and still utilizing what makes it great. Let me explain. A scientist is working with frogs, and he says jump to a frog. So the frog jumps. So the scientist notes that frogs with 4 legs jump. He cuts off a leg and says jump, and once again, the frog jumps. Looking at this small, closed context, he cuts off all the legs and says jump, and the frog does not. The scientist fighting, he notes that the frogs with no legs do not jump. Therefore, frogs here with their legs. No legs, deaf frog. Most children over the age of 5 notice the scientist's mistake. He associates things that are, at a distance, related, but not in the way he sees them. The frog jumps because he has legs to do so, not because he hears with his legs. We philosophize because it's part of our makeup, not because we learn to philosophize from philosophers. How does unknowingly philosophize connect to our happiness, while philosophy, or more simply reflection, affects how we understand meaning. To begin, we look to the Baumeister et al. Study titled Some Key Differences Between a Happy Life and a Meaningful One. This study will outline many of the connections and differences between happiness and meaning. Like previously stated, eudaimonia is that flourishing through meaning, and Baumeister supports that. He explains that meaningfulness and happiness are positively correlated, so they have much in common. But they do have substantially different roots. We need the meaning in our eudaimonia to create a byproduct of happiness because happiness is natural and meaning is cultural. Baumeister states that appraising the meaningfulness of one's life thus uses culturally transmitted symbols via language to evaluate one's life in relation to purposes, values, and other meanings that also are mostly learned from the culture. Meaning is thus more linked to one's cultural identity than happiness. Likewise, work from Huta and Ryan 2010 found that hedonic pursuits related to happiness produce short-term benefits, while long-term ones depended more on eudaimonic activities to cultivate fulfillment and the good life, which were mainly linked to meaningfulness. So to simplify, as Baumeister understands it, we create our meaning via our environment, and what we understand to be meaningful throughout time. Happiness, though a component of eudaimonia, creates a feeling of euphoria by satisfying immediate needs. This affect balance of present current state depends to some degree on whether basic needs are being satisfied. Well, one crucial advantage of meaning is that it is not limited to the immediately present stimulus in the environments. So we can be unhappy and still have meaning, and vice versa. But we need both to live a eudaimonic life. So eudaimonia is the version of happiness mixed with meaning that we will be focusing on. And where do we find this consistent flourishing in our daily lives? Flow. Psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi was a prisoner of war in World War II. He attended a lecture by Carl Jung, the famous psychoanalyst, and Csikszentmihalyi fell in love with the field of psychology. He found interest in studying happiness and began to look at the internal state of happiness in the human mind. Similar to ancients, he believes that happiness takes a committed effort to be manifested. These beliefs caused him to create his theory of flow. Flow is a state in which people are so involved in the activity that nothing else seems to matter. The experience is so enjoyable that people will continue to do it, even at great cost, for the sheer sake of doing it. Csikszentmihalyi 1990. This flow is when your level of skill aligns with your ability to meet a challenge. Marathon runners, musicians, writers, anyone who is successful in what they do falls into this state of utter focus. On a neurological level, there is a decreased activity in the prefrontal cortex as one falls into a state of subconscious actions with our high level of skill. If a task is too easy, then we become bored. And if our skill level isn't high enough, we become anxious. Our ability to use our skill to meet a challenge creates meaning in what we do.
So my name is Dr. Sion Kim Harris. My occupation is adolescent health researcher at Boston Children's Hospital.
Scientists like Dr. Sion Harris have begun to closely look at the human brain and its reaction to certain stimuli. As much as happiness feels indescribable, it's actually a chemical reaction happening in our brains.
It seems like there's 3 different components scientifically of happiness. There's the emotional component, there's the cognitive component, and there's the sensory component. And that those things are obviously very linked, but that, the key is to be aware that happiness isn't just simply a feeling. I mean, it's a feeling, but it's not just an emotion, that there's a whole piece around, how we think about the feeling and also, how it feels in our bodies. So one of the basic aspects of the experience of happiness is involves 2 major sets of brain chemicals. One involves endorphins, and then the other is dopamine. But there's other, chemical processes also happening. But the thing that we understand about, euphoria, pleasure, happiness is that there's a lot of dopamine and endorphins circulating in the reward circuit of the brain, the reward pathway, which involves different structures that are both in the middle part of the brain, which we call in the limbic area. It's evolutionarily the oldest part of the brain. We call it the reptilian brain. And then also there's a linkage of that part of the brain with sort of the cognitive part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. And often this is the part where the cognitive and the emotional interact in pleasure. It's both kind of our expectation of feeling pleasure that enhances the feeling of pleasure, as well as the actual experience of the dopamine and the endorphins being released in that part of the brain. The prefrontal cortex is actually the part of the brain that's very key to our being able to do what we imagine are like the executive functioning kinds of things, like what you would need to be a productive adult, which is know how to organize yourself towards working towards a goal, or making decisions, good decisions based on risks and benefits. So avoiding things that have a lot of risk and going towards things that may yield more benefit in your life. Those kinds of things are really critical, as I said, for really succeeding in life. And that part of the brain is still very immature, all the way into the early 20s or mid 20s, in terms of how well it's linked up to the rest of the brain, like the emotional parts of the brain, the parts of the brain that are wanting you to do the things that are immediately pleasurable. And so the prefrontal cortex is really needed for the putting the brakes on some of those things that may not be so helpful to you in the long run.
So this reaction, when our brain is high on happiness, is something ancient philosophers couldn't see, but they understood. Remember Aristotle, the one who first used the word eudaimonia? Well, he attended this place called the Academy, run by the famous philosopher by the name of Plato. Plato had his own ideas about how the brain works and how he experienced the world. Plato loved reason. Reason acted as a building block for many philosophers, and Plato saw the world in terms of how human beings can use reason. He imagines our brain as a charioteer, reining in two-winged horses. Quote, "The horse on the right, or nobler side, is upright and framed and well-jointed, with a high neck and a regal nose. He is a lover of honor, with modesty and self-control. Companion to true glory, he needs no whip, and is guided by verbal commands alone. The other horse is a crooked great jumble of limbs. Companion to wild boasts and indecency, he is shaggy around the ears, deaf as a post, and just barely yields to horsewhip and goad combined." End quote. The charioteer is reason, which must rein in desire. The creation of the charioteer made us human, and the gods gave humanity divinity through this reason. John Haidt, author of the happiness hypothesis, calls this the Promethean script, named after the famous titan in mythology that gave humans fire. However, Haidt proposed that the Promethean script is incorrect. Haidt talks about our reason in two parts, a rider and an elephant. The limbic system, what Dr. Harris called the reptilian brain, is the elephant, governed by emotions and desire, while the newly expanded neocortex is the reasonable rider. Haidt says that, quote, "When the neocortex came along, it made the rider possible, but it made the elephant smarter too. Because this neocortex is new, evolution still hasn't ironed out all the kinks. It still has emotion, and the rider has evolved to serve the elephant. The rider is placed on the elephant to help it make better choices, to think ahead like Baumeister's meaning entailed, move past the present moments, and help control the first automatic thoughts and reaction that the elephant takes." Now, we have all these actions we can take toward happiness. What about those chemicals dopamine and endorphin? Let's take one more quick look at Baumeister's study. As explained, he sees the idea of pure happiness as fleeting and focused on the present, while meaning is a thread through past, present, and future. However, happiness is rather stable, and this may reflect aspects of personality and temperament, so that people who are dispositionally inclined to enjoy the present and shrug off and avoid problems are constantly happier in the present, moment to moment, than other people. And this can be simplified in a single term, the happiness capacity. Picture a thermometer. When one person, let's name him A, is born, his happiness thermometer has the ability to reach 100 degrees. However, this other person, B, is born and is inclined toward depression, anxiety, and an array of other mental health difficulties. His thermometer can only reach 50 degrees. No matter what he does, it will not surpass that 50-degree mark. But he only knows that 50-degree mark, so we rate his happiness pretty high, because that's all he knows. A and B would each rate their life at a 7 on a 1 to 7 scale, but their thermometers have different scales. This thermometer is the happiness capacity. This scale is the Cantor ladder, something that was used in the measurements of the World Happiness Report. On a neurological level, many of us only have a certain capacity for happiness. So can Bowminster's meaning be worth pursuing? Is Csikszentmihalyi's flow useless in the darkness of depression? Or can eudaimonia add another dimension to our happiness, to our meaning? Can our flourishing in life be determined by us, and not purely from the control of some neurons? When we first begin to look at happiness, we must look at internal versus external factors. Let's make a circle of what we can and cannot control. The ancient philosopher Epictetus emphasized this on the first page of his handbook, where he says, quote, "Some things are up to us, and others are not." And he begins to create a list. Quote, "Things in our control are opinion, pursuit, desire, aversion, and in a word, whatever are our own actions. Things that are not in our control are body, property, reputation, command, and in one word, whatever are not our own actions. What we control is limited to the confines of our mind and how we take action." Epictetus believed that, quote, "The robber of your free will does not exist." However, in order to master our minds and express our free will, one must consider the ability to act in our free will does depend on external factors, and the environment is often able to dictate our ability to freely live in reaction to our own free will. Epictetus, that old white man I mentioned, he was something called a Stoic. Stoicism is rooted in self-mastery, through reason, and was all about how to teach your rider how to master your elephant. As Epictetus said, since we control our free will, we control our rider. We can't always control the events that affect us, but we can control how we react to things in our environment. Rather than trying to work to create a giant society that's better for everyone, they focused on self-improvement in order to deal with the environment at hand. They believe that before you can enact positive change, you must learn how to practice reason, temperance, justice, and be courageous. One of the most famous Stoics was Marcus Aurelius, a Roman emperor. In his Meditations, he states that, quote, "What then can help us on our way? One thing only, philosophy. This consists of guarding our inner spirit inviolate and unharmed, stronger than pleasure and pains, and never acting aimlessly, falsely, or hypocritically, independent of actions or inactions of others, accepting all that happens or is given as coming." Essentially, our mind is what allows us to live a happy life. But is there a modern world where natural happiness and cultural meaning of eudaimonia is just existing? Where is there complete ease in the use of these virtues? In 2012, the Earth Institute first released something called the World Happiness Report. The report not only outlines the happiest countries in the world, but it also discusses scientific research and ideas around happiness that are popularized during the time of the report. It looks at data across a 3-year span and finds trends as to how countries improve the happiness of their citizens. The report is pages and pages long, but the first thing that draws you in is the big question: which country is the happiest in the world? The first report ranked Denmark as the happiest country. The next report gave Switzerland the crown. Then back to Denmark, then Norway claims the title, and currently, Finland is dubbed the happiest country in the world. Though each frontrunner pulls ahead by a nearly insignificant margin, the single area of our world constantly remains in the top 10. The Nordic countries, comprised of Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden, all seem to be increasing the happiness of their citizens. I was lucky enough to visit Denmark, Finland, and Sweden in order to speak to an array of people with different experiences concerning happiness.